Well, it's wonderful to welcome you. HEY is short for Hempsall's Early Years, and Hempsall's Early Years really is a part of our organisation that's very much focused on what we hope is providing a modern, informed, values-led and positive approach to all things early childhood education. We want to be evidence-based and draw on the best research, but we also want to make sure that we think about early childhood education in the modern context. We really are here to think about raising quality, the confidence, and I'm really interested in bringing joy into our work as often as possible at the moment. It's definitely a theme of mine. We have created HEY because we want to focus on curriculum development. We want to support the best possible pedagogical processes and repertoires as well, with a focus on the earliest foundation stage in England, but also thinking about other wider contexts of early childhood education. We are a global family in this sector. So as I said, today's meeting is a Teams meeting. That means, as you've probably guessed, we can see and hear you if your cameras and microphones are not are on. We are recording the presentation part of today's session. So today, after my brief welcome, we're going to be hearing from Jan de Biel, who will take us through a few slides. So we're going to record that part of the session for you, and we will circulate that wider. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. If you have comments or questions, you can put your hand up by clicking on the raise hand button, or you can ask your question or make your comment in the chat function. I can promise you we will read all of those. But we may not have time to respond to all of those in today's meeting. And we won't be recording the Q&A session, so that's important for you to know. So we will just be sharing the recording of the presentation. Fantastic. After today's session, we will send you the link to the recording, and we'll send you a paper that gives you a little bit more information about the Moving the Box programme. Now, I think that is everything I need to say, Jan, and I'm delighted to introduce Jan, my colleague, who is the Programme Director for Hempsall's Early Years, HEY for short, and he's going to outline the context, the rationale, the reason, and the approach that we want to take. Today very much is about us telling you about our Moving the Box programme, and hopefully stimulating interest for you to get in touch and say, yes, we'd like a conversation about how Moving the Box may support you in your practice and in your organisation. So to work with us on that. So over to you then, Jan.
Thank you, James, and indeed, welcome to you all from wherever you're tuning in from. Really excited to introduce this project, which has been result of some quite significant and deep conversations and thinking about the landscape of early years, and how we particularly refine our pedagogy to support the trajectories of individual children. Although the project's ostensibly about a good level of development in the English context, and I'll come back to that. It's actually about pure pedagogy. It's actually resonates with that, again, with the EYFS, about that notion of the unique child. It's one of our key principles. And this is really drilling down and unpacking that. So I want to start, first of all, by saying much of what I'm going to say is very, very transferable. It is framed within the English context and a good level of development at the end of reception. So that's the kind of framing of how we're going to talk about the principles, but it is obviously really adaptable and transferable. So I know that we have, amazingly and brilliantly, we have lots of people here from preschools, from the PVI sector, who don't work with reception children. This project is absolutely adaptable to what you do, and actually it will be a really interesting piece of work to look at what a trajectory of success can be framed like in that context. You know, in reception you have the early learning goals, but actually it's much broader than that, and I'll come to that. We also have, and again amazingly, lots of people from the international sector. So again, you are not bound by the same sort of statutory requirements. So again, there's a really interesting piece of work in terms of identifying what that looks like and what those trajectories look like. So although I will talk around the GLD as the framing of this, it is much broader than that. So if we can go to the first slide. So the moving the box title comes from this graphic, which you may have seen, and the critical difference between equality and equity, and how if we want to support those individual journeys of individual children, actually that requires a much more fine-tuned pedagogical strategy. And in some cases, particularly where resources are limited, and let's not forget, the most important resource in any setting is you, the educator. It's about how we allocate those resources, how you spend your time as an educator and the children you target and support and the type of support that you give them. Some children, and this is a key principle, some children need more teaching and support than others. And actually part of our role as educators is to fine tune that, so we are giving children what they need, not necessarily spreading ourselves as thinly possible around every child. We'll come back to that because that's a significant element of significant principle that drives the project. So I want to start with a few 2 or 3 motifs, which again I'll refer back to. So the first one is Henry Ford's quote: "If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got." So why is that relevant? Because in England, we have had nearly 20 years of the EYFS. And if you include its precedents, the birth of 3 matters and the curriculum guidance foundation stage, we've had those frameworks, these consistent frameworks, for over 25 years. Now, one of the things we believe, and again, I will come to this because it's a true belief, it does happen. Early years is transformative of children's life chances. And what we do in early years massively impacts on the trajectories that children take. However, one of the things that has happened, certainly in England, is the gap, particularly between children from different socioeconomic status, has widened, not narrowed, in that time. Now that is a red flagged elephant in the room. That's really serious, and we have to ask ourselves, well, actually, why is that happening? We have had phenomenal amounts of investment and CPD and documentation and initiatives and a whole plethora of things to support this. So we need to ask ourselves, why that's not happening. Why is that gap not closing? And I think that it raises very, very serious questions about the pedagogical strategies we use. And if we think about that image of the difference between equality and equity, my hypothesis is that possibly is where it starts. If we give all the children the same things or the same pedagogical strategy, are we actually meeting their individual needs? And I think what the data is telling us and the outcomes are telling us is that's not the case. The second motif is this one, and it's the iceberg principle. So iceberg principle is 9/10 of the iceberg is underneath the surface. You don't see it. And in early years, that's particularly the case, because the tip of the iceberg for us, the bit you see, is the GLD. We could click on that. The GLD is the tip of our iceberg. That's the visible bit. That's the bit that gets recorded in data. That's the bit that goes into the statistical first release. That's the bit that shapes what people say about early years. X% of children are not reaching expected standard. X% of children don't have the expected standard in maths or literacy or language and so on. That's what they're talking about, the GLD. It's the visible part of what we do. But it's 1/10 of what really happens, and it's 1/10 of what we really do. And underneath the water level, underneath the visible part, is what really happens. And a key part of this project isn't saying isn't saying it's just about the GLD. It's actually looking at what makes a child successful, and that's going much, much deeper than whether or not they attain the early learning goal or not. And often when I've talked with educators about this and we start talking about that difference between a child who does and doesn't get a GLD, the conversation almost immediately goes into things like self-regulation, levels of motivation, levels of involvement, if you use the Leuven scales, their ability to retrieve and recall, their metacognitive processes and so on. And a key part of the project is going to be digging down to the principle of what makes a successful child. Yes, a successful child attains a GLD. That's what we've got in terms of our sort of statutory outcome. But it goes far, far deeper than that. And that's part of the project is going to be to analyse that. The final motif I want to use is about a circle of control. So interesting enough, when the government target came out around changing the level of GLD to 75%, I did put out a note, a message on social media, posing the question, what do we need to do to close the gap? What is it that people think needs to happen for that to be successful? And I got back some really interesting things, and things like we need to abolish child poverty, we need to address the cost of living crisis, we need to address the mental health of children's parents, and so on. And they were all really important things, but are they in our control? The answer is no. There are some things we can change. I'll come on to that in a minute, but many things we cannot change. But the things we can change can make a massively significant impact on children. The number of interactions we have with children can massively increase their development and progress. The cultural experiences and the cultural capital, experiential and social and physical capital we give to children can massively impact on their outcomes. So again, part of the project is going to be to identify the things we can change. And there is a lot we can change in the practice and in the day-to-day provision that we have with children. One of the things I've ended up building my career on is that piece of research which is you have 1,000 interactions every single day. Each of those interactions is a life-changing moment for that child. When you interact with a child, you physically change their brain structure. So going back to that first motif of moving the box, the more you stack up the interactions, for example, for children who need that, the more progress, development and thriving that they're going to do. So this isn't about creating extra workload. This isn't about doing extra things. This is about repurposing what you are doing, but making sure that smartly we channel the resources, including you or predominantly you, into the children who need it most. And my hypothesis is, based on the evidence, that can make a significant difference. To the level of children who get GLD, which is a government target, but more significantly for underneath the tip of the iceberg, for the changes you change in those children's trajectories. And we have huge amounts of research that show that. So if we go on to the next slide, it's worth revisiting what we know about the long-term impact of early years provision. It's worth reminding ourselves of some of the data and projects and longitudinal studies which demonstrate categorically that not just early years provision, but actually the quality of early years provision and the quality of how well it tunes into individual children has a life-changing impact and effect. And I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves of the power of what we do and the power of what's possible. So, for example, if we go to the first one, sorry. This is from the HighScope study, and we haven't perhaps talked about, remembered this for a while. But the high scope study, this is probably quite old now. This study, those children are probably in their kind of 50s and nearly 60s now. But if you're not familiar with the preschool, it's a huge piece of research which demonstrated that children from particularly deprived areas, and it focused on that very specifically, made significant social and personal outcomes, as well as academic ones, dependent on the quality of the early years provision that they had. And the program there, the bars in grey are the high scope study, the plan, do, review, and all the associated principles around that. You can see from that data, it dramatically influenced the life chances and trajectories of those people. So if we go to the next one, this is a kind of more recent study. It's a cumulative study from the States, but again, I think it's transferable. Again, looking at the impact of early childhood education, high quality early childhood education has a huge impact in the kind of outcomes and benefits of those children. So we are getting this collective residue of information which points strongly to the possibilities of how that can work. And if we go on, we've got our own EPI study from the UK. We go on to the next slide. Yeah, so this is, thank you. This is the impact of mathematics on outcomes in mathematics in year 6, relating it to the quality of their early childhood provision. And again, a strong correlation with those academic outcomes as a result of the quality that they experienced. And in the next slide, that's equally true of literacy and reading particularly. Children who went to high quality early years provision did better than if they went to medium or low quality provision. And actually, one of the most interesting parts of this is that children who went to no preschool at all did better. If you look at that last block of data, children who went to no preschool or early years provision did better than children who went to a low quality. So we know that quality matters, and we know that fine-tuning that quality, particularly around individual children, and particularly around children who are most sensitive to the quality of curriculum and the quality of pedagogy, can have a dramatic impact on their trajectories. It truly impacts on that concept of the unique child, but it requires us to think about things slightly differently. So if we go on to the next slide, two of the more longitudinal and significant, particularly qualitatively significant pieces of research were these two. Again, they're relatively quite old actually in terms of in research terms and in early years terms, where we change all the time. But they were, again, real drivers in my thinking about what was possible. So Performing Against the Odds was an offshoot of the EPI study, and it looked at children who had a trajectory of failure, but who didn't. Children who, despite the odds, ended up being really successful. And it goes through the different things, the different elements of what were different about those children. It's a really powerful piece of research to show how those trajectories could be changed. And again, as part of the project, we'll certainly be drawing from those elements, because they are, they're the evidence base of what makes a difference. The other one, which from a few years after that, was the work by Chris Pascal and Centre for Research in Early Childhood, which looked at high achieving white working class boys. Which again identify, although that's a specific group, were identified as at risk of not thriving, but these are children who did. And again, it analyzes what were the factors, what were the elements that flipped that script, that changed that trajectory from children who were on a trajectory to not thriving to ending up thriving. And if you're familiar with those and you've read them before, you'll realize it's not rocket science. It's not doing anything radically different. It's actually being true to our principles about what we believe is right for children, and taking the time to actually do those things. I was speaking at a conference yesterday, and we talked a lot about that pressure of time, how we think there isn't time to do this, there isn't time to do that, to do these different aspects, but actually there isn't time not to do that. And again, that's something we will focus on as part of the project. So what is the challenge? And on the back of all that, what is the challenge that we face at the moment? Currently have a GLD of 67.7%. So just over, 2/3 of children get what's described as a good level of development. And that is an interesting figure. And there is a narrative, and there is a challenge to whether or not those are the right kind of early learning goals, and whether or not they are developmentally appropriate, and so on. But I suppose, if I'm being provocative, if 67.7% of children can attain them, what is it that's preventing the others? And that's the essence of the project. How do we differentiate between those children? What is it that those children who do attain it have that the other children need to have supported and elevated and enabled? And that's what I mean about pure pedagogy. It's pure pedagogy tuned around individual children. And we know that iceberg principle, what sustains children is the GLD, but also the things that make the GLD possible. And again, that's going to be a key part of the project. Because we've had the profile for so long, over 20 years, there are strong correlations between the attainment of GLD and the impact on later outcomes on GCSEs, on A levels, and so on. There's still a relationship between that. Now, the GLD, as I said, is the bit you see, but actually it's what makes that GLD possible that is a really key part of the focus. So we have this target of 75%, and I think it should be 80%. I think the target should be higher than that. And I think if we really drill down and we really identify and we really create these individual pathways of success for children, I think that figure could be higher. But as I've said, we have a widening gap. Socioeconomic status gives us a widening gap, and that is a concern. And that challenges, I think, some really key, thank you, Kathy, some really key elements. And part of that is looking at those trajectories of failure to thrive and those that attain succeed. What is the difference between them? And going back to the circle of control, what is it we can change within that? Because there is a lot, and there's huge amounts of evidence to show actually good and outstanding early years provision can ameliorate to a big extent the impact of socioeconomic status. That's the power that we have. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, we could ask ourselves, why is this? Why do we have that differential? So we know children come with a whole range of starting points, different pre-reception experiences, and huge variations in cultural capital, experiential capital, social capital, linguistic capital, physical capital. Some of that is you could argue is innate, is biological. A lot of it, though, is the mediation between the nature of those children and their experiences, and that's what we know about the impact of EYFS. We can't change children's DNA necessarily, or at all, sorry, but we can change the experiences that support and enable that. Some children, you think about that first image, the child on the far left, those are the children that will always thrive. There are some children who will always thrive. Some children are less sensitive to others than the quality of provision. And because of their experiences, because of what they bring to early years provision, they will always be successful. Those are the children who've been read to and taught to and have been in interesting places and have this mass of different kinds of capitals. They bring that into the EYFS setting and they make the most of it. And that's what the EYFS and early child provision is designed to do. We work on the principle that you offer children opportunities and experiences and resource areas, and they make the most of it. They bring that and they lead their own learning. They show their fascinations and interests, and on that they build all kinds of powerful learning things. And that's true for some children, and those children will always thrive. But some children are much more sensitive to the quality of revision, and they're much more sensitive to the fact that they don't come with that capital. And effectively, what can happen is they then become alienated from that environment. Some children have never seen bricks before. They've never seen small world creatures before, or small world figures. They've never seen paints and writing materials. They are immediately at that sort of disadvantage. So as one children slip past them and start drawing a picture of the meal they had last night or someone's birthday party, those children are immediately at a disjuncture. But that's the gap we can solve. That's the gap we can change, because we can support and divert our resources to those children so they get to the same point as the others. So next slide poses that question. What, why is that? Why is the gap increasing? Why is that gap not being ameliorated? Why is not entering into an EYFS provision not solving that automatically? We know that children from particularly those at risk of not thriving are most sensitive to things like the quality of the curriculum and the sequential ability to look at learning skills, knowledges and behaviours, and also the types of pedagogies that support it. So we know that the curriculum lies at the heart of that. And remember, the EYFS, if you're in England, is not a curriculum. It's a framework of aspirations. And curriculums are always grown, not given. It's about you developing a curriculum that supports the children that you work with. So we know, and this came out in Strong Foundations, which I'll talk about in a moment, we know that children who are experiencing a curriculum that isn't as robust are the ones most likely to suffer. The child on the left, they will make their own way around it. They're less sensitive to the variations in quality. So that's about curriculum. The other element is about pedagogy. We inadvertently and accidentally and unintentionally do sometimes have a one-size-fits-all pedagogical strategy. And because it works for some children, the assumption is it can work for all children. And I think I would go as far as say, I think that's where the gap begins. Because for some children, it doesn't work. Some children will need more support and teaching. And remember, teaching isn't just direct instruction. It's everything you do as an adult is a teaching behavior. So it's about questioning, it's about provoking, it's about listening, it's about observing, it's all the behaviors you have. Some children need more of that than others. So this idea of a universal offer, without acknowledging the individuality and the uniqueness of the children within it, becomes really, really important. One of the things I'll talk about, and those of you who've worked with me recently or in the past will know I talk about that concept of invisible children. You all have invisible children in your setting, and if you want to know who they are, you write from memory all the children in your setting, in your group or in your class, and you'll get to the end and you'll be missing 2 or 3, and you think, who am I missing? It's these ones. Those are your invisible children. Those are ones who slip between the cracks. They're a little bit on the periphery of things, and those are the ones who are most at risk of not thriving. So part of the project and part of the box that we're moving is towards those children, because they need that support more often. Again, one of the things in Strong Foundations, and it's not new, it's things we've known for a while, is we often inadvertently and unintentionally interact with the most confident and the most articulate children, sometimes because they don't let you not, and actually it's the least confident and least articulate children who need the most interaction. So sometimes it's checking that cognitive bias and actually saying, where do I target my interactions at this point, rather than going where there's lots happening and there's a really interesting project developing with a group of children working together and you can see these teachable moments. Actually, is that about seeking out the children who need greater support and interaction? So if we go on to the next slide. So, just a bit of backup for this. And I know Strong Foundations was contentious when it came out, and that did confuse me a little bit because there's nothing in there that we don't already know. And actually, I think it raises some interesting reflection points and questions about how we construct, particularly our pedagogy, and how that links to our curriculum. Most already, the most knowledgeable and confident thrive in reception and year one, and again, this is the gap. This is the gap emerging. Those who most need help secure foundations do not always get the teaching and the practice, the rehearsal that they need. And again, part of that is inducting them and supporting them and scaffolding how they use provision with the aspiration of them doing it autonomously. We can't assume some children know how to do that. And again, this is I work with schools and settings all the time. Is it about 3 or 4 a week? And one of the common messages that comes through is, particularly post-COVID, and particularly as an impact of screen time or excessive screen time, they are having to teach children how to use objects or how to use small world, sand, water, a writing area, and so on. And that's where the gap starts. And the positive bit of this is we can change that. That's inside our circle of control. We can change what that looks like and how that works. So we go to the next slide. Again, this is from Strong Foundations. Some schools are not ensuring that children have foundational knowledge. They're not having that support, those deep foundations, which is why it's called the foundation stage, and that impacts as children go through Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. It's how the gap widens. Sometimes that's about curriculum. Sometimes the curriculum is overloaded. There isn't the opportunity for children to practice and rehearse their self-led, self-motivated activities. But possibly the most crushing statement in here is that the penultimate one. Sometimes children's learning is left to chance. Now, for the child on the left standing on the box, that doesn't matter as much because they will make sense of it. They will find their way. But for the child who comes without those cultural and experiential capitals, that leaving to chance is where the gap begins. And a key element of the project is precisely that nothing is left to chance. By focusing on those children, by focusing on what it is they need to flip the trajectory from failure to thrive to successful, that is not leaving anything to chance. And I think that's again a really important principle of the project. So if we go to the next slide, that is in some senses is a bleak picture, but I don't feel bleak about it. I think actually we have real potential to make a significant difference. We have massive opportunities to change that, to literally change the trajectories of children's lives. And those 2 projects I mentioned, the Perform Against the Odds and Higher Achieving White Working Class Boys, that's exactly what happened. Those children ended up being really successful. Similarly with the HighScope study, that was success that went on into their 40s and beyond. And part of that was academic, certainly, but a lot of that was about social and economic success as well. So this can be life-changing, and there are things we can do No, we can't change parents' mental health. No, we can't change the cost of living crisis, but we can change the experience that children get, and that can be transformative. So part of the project, a key element of the project that we'll go into quite deeply in the first session is what we mean by a successful child. What does that comprise? And there are a number of sort of strategies and techniques, if you like, we're going to use to do that. And the purpose of doing that is to be able to identify not just the children who are at risk of not thriving, but what it is within their profile with a small p that needs particular support. How are we going to change those trajectories? So part of that will be identifying who those children are. And again, we'll talk about that in the first and second session. I'll explain about that right at the end. And you know, the iceberg principle. If the GLD is the bit we see, what lies beneath? What is it that makes those children successful? What makes them able to demonstrate an early learning goal in language, for example, or in writing or in mathematics? The knowledge is part of it, of course it is, but actually the knowledge that you need to get the early learning goal rests significantly on learning behaviours, and that's something we will unpack in detail. And we need to change. We need to change our pedagogical strategies. We need to perhaps step back from what we are assuming about children, and look more clearly at those individual journeys. What do those individual needs? That idea of fine-tuned support, individualized support within it. And I'm making that sound complex, and it's less complex than it should be, or less complex than it sounds, because it's about saying, as every support of a unique child should, what does that child need to be successful? And part of the project is to monitor that really carefully, and I'll come to that because I think there's an action research element to this, which is going to build up a really interesting database of evidence of how we support children's learning development, particularly where there are challenges from their starting point. So if we go to the next slide, kind of unpicking that a little bit, if you will be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a staple of the early years project. We know that successful learners are children who have their basic needs and psychological needs met. Sometimes I do worry a little bit that it ends sometimes with psychological needs, their self-esteem, their belongingness, and so on, what's identified there, their well-being, and their security and attachment. Of course, they're important, but that's not the tip of the triangle. The tip of the triangle is self-actualization. And Maslow and others have talked about how that rests on those things, but it doesn't just happen. Actually, it's remarkably complex. And as educators, of course, we do those lower rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But part of our responsibility is to ensure that when we consider self-actualization, that we look at that in the right amount of depth. So before we go to the next slide, that's some thinking that I've been doing. So what I'm going to show you in a minute is it's work in progress, and I'm genuinely interested in what people think about it. But what I've looked at is what self-actualization depends on, and what does it rely on. So if children have their basic and psychological needs secure, how do we move into the top of that triangle? How do we move into children who will be infinitely and absolutely successful? And how do we give them that foundation which ensures, or is likely to ensure, their success as they go through Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2? So the next slide. This is my thinking at the moment. So again, it's really there for discussion. I'm genuinely interested in what people think. And it starts, if you look at the bottom, it starts with, I think, are the two cornerstones of this, which is well-being and motivation. So it kind of drifts a little, the tendrils go, I think, further down the the hierarchy of needs than just self-actualization. Children who don't have secure well-being are unlikely to be successful and are actually successful learners, because that's a kind of fairly uncontested. The other element is a real interest that I've developed recently about the concept of motivation, because children are born with exploratory drive. You're unlikely to find an unmotivated baby. Babies are biologically primed to find out about themselves and the world. Birth to 7, we know, this incredible period of neurological growth, and that's driven by this biological evolutionary urge to find out about the world, to copy the adults around them, to absorb information. I was speaking at a conference yesterday with Dan Worry, and if you're not familiar with his work, that's what he does. He looks at child development in this very, very specific but very accessible way. And all the children you see in there have high levels of motivation. But what if they get into reception, for example, and they don't? What do we do? We don't really have strategies for that. So I want to identify motivation as a critical factor for success. And it's interesting because some children are motivated by lots of things because they've had lots of experiences. For other children, you have to find, and it's going down a narrow pathway to find the thing that really excites them and motivates them. And because they're not used to some of the experiences or some of the sort of frameworks we use for children, things like themes and topics, they become even more alienated from it. But they will be interested and motivated by something, and it's about finding that. And I genuinely believe that's one of our key starting points. That builds into what we might call executive functioning and cognitive development. The learning behaviours, the processes of becoming a learner, and that interplays with knowledge, both core knowledge, which is outlined broadly in the EYFS, but also personal knowledge. And again, that's some work I've done a lot of thinking around. We have our core knowledge, but we have personal knowledge, which is individual to us, and we all have that. It starts in early childhood. We have a body of knowledge about something which actually defines us as who we are and our identity, and that leads into what I think is the purpose, not just of education but of life, which is intellectual pursuit. And that's a phrase you'll be familiar, but I borrowed or appropriated from Lillian Katz's work. She talks about mastery of foundational skills or basic knowledge in pursuit of their intellectual pursuits. Now, I often get asked, if you don't like the word play, which is another issue, what would you use? And actually, I think it's because it's much broader. But if I had to choose a phrase, that's what I'd use. Children are highly intellectual, and actually empowering them to pursue their interests, their motivations, the stuff that interests them, the stuff that inspires them and ignites that love of learning, is surely the purpose of what we do, because we are setting up the potential and the actuality of lifelong learning. So again, that's the model we'll revisit as part of the project. And I've already at this point kind of thought differently about it, which I'll adjust. But the GLD, as you can see, is about that bit. It's about how children demonstrate knowledge. And once again, it's the tip of the iceberg, because there's lots around that which feed into the possibility of getting a GLD, but we don't actually see. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll also know that there is an uplift in early years pupil premium. And if you're not familiar with it, there's some really interesting resources and guidance from the Education Endowment Foundation. But this came in a very sort of timely moment, because if we're thinking about how we support those children, this might be a way of providing some funding streams to enable us to do that. And on the next slide, there's a blog by Dr. Julian Grenier, which talks about what you might use. So Partly it's about the quality of practice, undeniably. For that second one, tailoring personal support. So sometimes that might be about an individual pathway. Sometimes that might be about a broader approach, as change in your pedagogical strategy, which is specifically designed to support those children. And again, that's one of the things that we'll unpick as part of the project. So if we go to the final slide. So this is the framework of the project as it looks at the moment. As I said, it's adaptable and transferable. It is, as I've said, it's been framed around reception classes in England, but obviously that is something that can be refined and shaped around other specific contexts. There are an infinite number of variables, and we'll work with that. But the basic structure of the program is to start with, and there is again, I'm working within the academic year, which I know isn't relevant, isn't pertinent to all of you. But if we take that as our starting point, so it is quite time dependent. So the back end of summer term, we'll have is the first session, and that will be unpicking a lot of the things that I've talked about today. What is a successful child? What's the difference between a child who is thriving and a child who's not thriving? What is the difference between those trajectories? What can we do as part of that? So it will be an exploration of a lot of that research, identifying those key strands of the things that did make a difference, and looking at how we then might frame that approach going into the next academic year. So that will leave people with a thinking to do and processing to do, and possibly some gap tasks. And then we'll reconvene early on in September. So early on in September, certainly by the end, and we will be looking at identifying those children, identifying the children who on entry, we think there is a risk that they will not thrive. It's then unpacking the profile of that child to say, right, in our circle of control, what are the things we can do? What does that child need to get to that point, to get to the same place as that other child? And then what we can do about it? And that's where we move the box, because we move the box to make sure that child gets what they need. So over the next half terms, we'll have, and again, this is variable possibly, we will have regular catch-up points where we both look at the progress that's been developed, and one of the things we'll develop in the first day, or we'll give you, is a tool for looking at that, and a tool for monitoring and looking at children's development. But secondly, as I said, I think there's real potential here for building up a really rich database of divergent pedagogical strategies that follow the pathways of different children and provide different things. It might be interventions, it might be particular support, it might be the particular types or a process of interactions. Again, and there's a rich, very rich database of resources to draw from. Shrek is the one that, for example, the one that comes to mind when I talk about that. So over that time, we will meet regularly to do that. And again, depending on the cohorts, they might be focused around particular areas or particular regions or a particular types of challenge for children. For example, and I'm freestyling here, but self-regulation might be one of the dimensions that people say that's the difference. That's the difference between those children. So it might be we have a group, because we can do this online, that focuses around strategies for that. It might be, for example, children's writing. Children's writing is the bit, so actually always the lowest attained ELG. That's the difference between them getting it, not getting it. What can we do about that? Again, so we might be focusing around that, and that will depend on the nature and the kind of diversity of the cohorts that do that. Then June 2026, when you've if it's a reception class and you've assessed their GLD, and they've all not miraculously, they've all, because of your hard work, have got it. That's the point where I think we'll evaluate that. and we'll think about what that tells us about how we need to look at our practice. And I'm sure there are key messages which we'll want to disseminate. So that's moving the box. I'm going to hand you back to James. What we are doing, thank you, whoever that was. There's an email address there. I think we are looking for expressions of interest at this point. So the email address is obviously hey@coram-hempsals. We will field those and curate those. And I think that the next process would be, for example, if you're a multi-academy trust or a local authority, that might be a meeting that we set up to discuss how that would work in practice. If you are an individual school, by all means, please still contact us. And it might be we need to create some clusters or some groups that can work with you. So I'm going to hand you back to James.
Thank you, Jan. And I think there's for me, I'd like us to think about how individuals might be able to get involved, individual practitioners. There will, of course, be a cost attached to the delivery of moving the box, but we're wanting to. Today was a great opportunity for us to set that proposal and to get a sense of what the response is and the level of interest, so that we can shape our response to say, well, okay, this is the interest, this is how I think we can make it happen. And I'm delighted that we're taking this initiative from Hay, and being on, not to mix my metaphors, but to be on the front foot really, and proactive in terms of how we want to empower, enable, enthuse, motivate the workforce and the sector to deliver the objectives of moving the box. I mean, it occurs to me that when DfE, we are used to DfE setting as challenges, aren't we? In fact, it's the whole reason why HempSource was created 25 years ago, was to help people navigate the challenges posed to the sector in whatever they may be, setting up Sure Start, children's centres, out-of-school childcare, early years entitlements, all sorts of things. And we rush, I think, sometimes into enthusiastic action to be compliant, and we embrace the challenge, and and that's not always a good thing. I think sometimes we need to pause and reflect and think, actually, how do we propose to do this ourselves? I take your point in terms of, is 75% ambitious enough? As if 75% of the target, by definition, 25% of children aren't meeting those good levels of development, which is an injustice for a quarter of children. So I think there are potentially risks and opportunities from what's happening in the external environment, and I can see how you've constructed a programme that can help with those risks and opportunities. You've talked about clear sense of quality in a successful child, identifying those children and making sure that we're not I think perhaps one of the risks is that many people will want to push children through as close to the GLD measures as possible to reach those sort of percentage targets. I don't know how that target came about. I have my suspicions, but I also think perhaps the increase of the early years entitlements will have an effect on the levels of GLD by default of there being more provision and more children in it. But practice in terms of its quality is going to be significantly important, isn't it? As you've described, curriculum and pedagogy, and carefully monitoring and tracking that progress to ensure that it achieves the objectives that we are all ambitious for. Lots of hearts on comments here around bringing the joy back into or protecting the joy, I think, of the sector. I think there's hundreds of thousands of practitioners out there who are joyful in their practice, but I think there's initiatives in the centre and nationally that can do more to build that sense of joy, to enhance it, to increase it. And I mentioned joy and achievement right in my opening remarks earlier. So lots of support I can see on the chat around that rekindling the joy, bringing in the passion, thinking about um, the application of that approach. And we said at the beginning, we're very much about the evidence base and the research base. So I think Louise Cheetham has commented a very inspiring session. So thank you very much. So I would reiterate that, Jan, absolutely. So what we're going to do is what I said at the beginning. That's been a terrific opportunity for us to set out our proposal to you. We will send you a paper, all of you, that sets out a little bit more detail about the Moving the Box programme and how you may get involved with it. And we will send you the recording link of the presentation. So, and that, of course, will have the slides on it, which will enable you to review the content, to revisit it, or to share it with colleagues, because we're very keen to see how we can reach and work with as many local authorities, multi-academy trusts, schools, practitioners, settings, and other organisations as possible to ensure that we do move the box for the children that do need that, and that we make the most of this focused opportunity on GLDs, but we look wider than that, I think, in terms of the difference that we make, which of course is the core purpose of high quality early childhood education. Any final words, Jan?
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at some of the chat and the questions, and someone said you need to be part of a school to take part in this, and the answer is no, absolutely. I mean, you need to work with children or be responsible for people who work with children. So I know there's some strategic leads who have commented. But yes, I think, going back to what I said at the beginning, I as I said, I framed it within sort of reception and GLD, but it's much bigger than that. And EYFS is a massive phase in its own right, from birth to 5. And I think the more people that get involved in that, and the more people that refine their practice as part of this project, I think the more beneficial it's going to be. So it'll be really interesting, and again, we can create virtual groups for people perhaps working in a range of settings, or perhaps even in a range of different contexts. And I think that will be really interesting. I think Chairman Mao said, "Let 100 flowers bloom," and that's always been my principle in terms of looking at projects. I think we are such a diverse sector in terms of our backgrounds and our contexts and our own experiences and our own pathways to getting here. And I think that's the strength of the sector. We are incredibly diverse, and I think we need to embrace that. And I think looking at concepts like this and looking at the diversity within it will really strengthen us as a profession.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really this is you'll know this is my excited face. I'm really excited about the potential that this could do, and I'm really keen to to get started. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so then our next actions are to process the recording and circulate that along with our paper. We will want our paper to respond to the comments that you've made today, and any comments that come into us through the Hey inbox, hey@cornpencils.org.uk, thoughts, ideas, requests, expressions of interest, asks for meetings and conversations, and let's see where this interesting and exciting proposal goes, and what we do with it. So look out in your inboxes, please, for the recording and the paper, and get in touch in the meantime. But it is 3 o'clock. Golden rule is to not overrun, so we do have to say goodbye for today. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Goodbye.